about the whole unit and why we're reading what we're reading and when, and then I'm going to go right into the reading for today. Because this is a natural history collections class, it's, I think, most appropriate to cover science learning and public engagement with science, not just visitor engagement at any museum. So we'll start this unit with a reading about learning science in informal environments. We start with this reading, you can see it here, Chapter 5, Learning in Designed Settings, because it brings several important issues to the forefront. First, it goes over the difference between formal and informal settings for learning. That is, museums, nature centers, science centers, etc. They're informal settings, or more precisely, they are designed settings. Learning there is different in important ways from schools, which are called formal learning settings. Other informal settings include TV and books for the public, things found on the internet, but those examples of informal learning settings are not designed settings. So that is, designed settings are a subclass of informal learning settings. The second issue that comes to the forefront in this reading is that science learning is reasonably well defined and researched. And so this report presents the portion of that science learning literature that applies to designed settings, which is not quite as well researched yet, but you need a solid basis in the traditional literature around engaging learners at museums, and in particular in science learning, before I can introduce you into the really revolutionary ideas about participation, not just engagement in a museum, and science learning and communication and engagement that's coming out in the last 2 years. So starting with this very first Chapter 5, this is a report from the National Research Council here of the National Academies of Sciences. They are advisors to the nation on science, engineering, and medicine. This council set up a committee of 14 experts in education, psychology, media, and informal education to examine the potential of non-school settings for science learning. And they list the committee here, so they tell you who was on this. They published this in 2009, so the summary of the literature is from before 2009. I want to make sure that you're keeping all of this in context. This is not an easy to read report, and it is long, so I'm going to do a very thorough reading guide for you. This is also not an easy to digest reading where it has lists that summarize their important points. So I'm going to go through pretty carefully and tell you when I want you to make your own list so that you are summarizing these important points. This is sort of transitioning us from textbook reading into reading for scientists, reading for museum professionals. So the readings will be getting a little harder as we move on through this unit and the rest of the units. So I think that you guys are well set up after going through the reading guides and learning how to digest an article, but I'm going to be really thorough to make sure that you make this transition well. In this report, there are a number of chapters. So you are only reading Chapter 5 here, Science Learning in Designed Settings. You're not reading about all of the other types of settings and about all of the other work that they've done. So they have developed a framework in this report that articulates science-specific capabilities that are supported by informal environments. And in fact, they describe that. I'm going to have you read a little bit of the summary. So you're going to start at the bottom here. You're going to start reading here. This tells you who did this report. It tells you where they gathered their information from, which is critical for understanding the report. So you're going to read through here. You're going to skip ahead. Let's make sure this is coming out as highlighted. We're going to skip ahead, and you're going to read here. This is how they're defining their outcomes, how to determine whether and how learning occurs. And then they're going to introduce this idea of strands of science learning. before you get any further into this, I want to talk to you about that strands of science learning. So they've developed this framework, right, about the different science-specific capabilities that are supported in informal environments. And the idea is that a person's understanding and capabilities in science are a complex braid or web of experiences, both from formal and informal settings. The components of this braid or web can be broken down into a bunch of different categories, and I'm going to give you a little picture. Other people have done this in other settings, and so they have the idea of the different strands coming together, and the different strands have different topics. This is one that was developed for math, so it's not the one from our book. They don't have a nice image that I could give you, so let's go back here. The components of the web can be broken down into 6 categories, and so you're starting in this summary because I want you to read these categories, be familiar with these strands, because they divide your chapter up into sections on each strand, but they don't explain what the strands are in this chapter. They've done that in a previous chapter, and I don't want you to read that whole previous chapter and this one. So read through this, and what I want you to do is pull this page out and keep it with you, okay? You're going to need this over and over again. So keep it with you. I want you to be noting, I want you to read the definition of the strand before you read the section on the strand. So as I go through this, I'll do that for you. Okay, now we keep going. And I want you to pick up reading here with the recommendations. So I want you to read about recommendations for exhibit and program designers, okay? These recommendations are the result of everything that they've gone through in this whole report, this massive report, okay? So I want you to keep this in front of you as well, and I want you to list what research supports any of these different recommendations. And I'm going to point out a couple of them here. I'm not going to do too much with the learning goals, but I am going to say to pay attention to interactivity, pay attention to why multiple ways for engagement are important and multiple settings are important. Prior knowledge, experience, and interest will become important. And then as you go down through here, you need to think about why consequences for community members are also important. And then I'm just going to point out here that they want people to be using the science of human learning and development, so research, right? This is a Academy of Sciences, and they're very research focused. Okay. You're going to keep reading through here, and one reason you're reading through here is because when you get down to this recommendation 4, that recommendation is for you when you make your video. You are a frontline staff when you make that video, so I want you to read that. Okay, now we're going to get into your chapter. All right, in the beginning here, they're going to introduce what a designed space is. I want you to pay attention to a designed setting versus a classroom setting. Make a list. When I tell you make a list, do it. Go through here, and every time they say one way that a designed setting, here's a defining characteristic of designed spaces, make a list. What is it about them? There's more in this paragraph as well. You're going to keep reading and making your list as you go through here. Now I've asked you to pay attention to the recommendations from the summary, right? As you read through, you'll get to this sentence right here, and this sentence is telling you, this is a comment on recommendation number 1 from the summary. I'm going to go back and look at recommendation number 1 from the summary. Recommendation number 1, okay? Third bullet point says, provide multiple ways for learners to engage with concepts, practices, and phenomena within a particular setting. Okay, so what did that sentence say? Promote or support a variety of emotional responses. Surprise, puzzlement, awe, and a variety of processing modes, observation, discovery, contemplation, increases the likelihood of connecting with a greater variety of people and encouraging them as learners. This is from a research paper by Jacobson. Okay, so you're going to make a note of this on your summary, right? Your summary of recommendations. So So this is just one example of how you'll be going through and going back to that summary. I'm not going to point out all of them. I want you to be doing that. This is one lens that you're viewing this article through. Okay. Now we're going to get into an introduction to learning in design spaces. You know what the design spaces are. How does learning happen in there? So you're going to kind of skim through this. This is pretty obvious stuff, right? Traditional museums and science centers versus living versus non-living collections. They go a little bit on research on the learning in the design spaces, and that it does exist across all of those 6 strands that they talked about. They point out very quickly the importance of the number of people who visit informal science settings. So pay attention to that. Why is that important? Now you get to the end of this section and you're going to hit this strand 1, and the rest of this chapter is going to revolve around sections on each strand. Like I said before, this is not a super easy to read chapter, so what I want you to do already, go all the way down to the end of this chapter. Let's see if I can find it real quickly. And they're going to have a section which is a conclusion. Okay, in this conclusion, they tell you about each strand. I think this is a great way to set this up. I don't think they've set it up particularly well. So I want you to read this conclusion now. Here it tells you, for strand 1, there's evidence of learner excitement and strong positive emotional response, blah, blah, blah. Pay attention to strand number 4, where they say there's some evidence for aspects of strand 4, but it's limited, right? So that helps you when you get to strand 4 to know what you're looking at. So read this conclusion all the way through here, okay? This will set you up now to go back and read about each strand. Okay, so here we are back at strand 1. You will already have your summary of the strands from back on, where was that page? In the summary introduction part, right, on page 4, you will have that list of the strands in front of you that you can look at. So you're defining what is strand 1 before you start reading about it. Okay, as you go through here, take a look at the layout of this section. There are 3 subsections, one on excitement, one on interest, and one on comfort. Organize your notes around that. For this section, what is the link between excitement and learning? What is the influence of excitement on learning? Try to take that away from this section. Then you get into the section on interest, and the question I want you to answer is, how does the interest develop? Where do museums fit in the development of interest? They have a breakout box here, but you're going to finish your reading on interest first. I want to point out that they say, what is an excellent exhibition? Okay, so they say that this is true. What research in this section then supports this claim? Okay. Finishing with this section here, what is intrinsic and extrinsic motivation? They talk about that here. How does it relate to learning in a designed setting? So answer that question, and then you're going to read the very last section of strand 1, comfort. And this is an important bit of research here about comfort being critical. And here they go back to the literature being summarized in Sorel, right? Sorel is the one that talked about what an excellent exhibition is. Okay, now I want you to go back and read that box on field trips. This is an important box. Field trips are a critical part of designed settings. What are field trips effective at? What is their impact dependent on? How do we know? What does the research say? In particular, how does teacher involvement play a role? How do we know that advanced preparation for field trips impacts the learning? I asked you to answer the question, what is the impact of field trips dependent on? I'm telling you now, right? Advanced preparation for field trips, how does it impact? Do teachers follow up? Is following up important? They talk about hands-on versus structured activities, and if those are important and how, so pay attention to that. Here's the part about follow-up by teachers. Excellent. Okay, so now you're going to get up to strand number 2.